Hi, my name is Miles Goldsmith, and this is my podcast, Game Design Hour, where I interview the people behind the video games you love. On today's episode, I'm interviewing Albert Shih about his work on the video game Superliminal. Before we get into today's episode, I wanted to let you know about today's sponsor, Hoffman's Woodstuffs. They specialize in the design and fabrication of custom furniture made from reclaimed or sustainably sourced hardwoods. They also make custom goods and gifts for any occasion. You can find them on Instagram at Hoffman's Woodstuffs. Or you can go and check out their website by clicking the link in the description or by heading on over to hoffmanswoodstuffs.net. Stick around to the end of the episode to find out how you can get 20% off your next order. Let's get into the interview. Hi.
Hey, Miles.
So when did you first realize you wanted to work in the video game industry?
So I was in college and I actually took a pretty easy programming class that they made for non-computer programmers, I guess. But I found it was really fun. I was spending more than expected on it. I was doing like 20 hours a week on it. And I was like, well, maybe I can transition this to, a video game thing, right? Obviously, even while doing that, I was making a lot of small games. And whenever I had a chance to do a project that was tangentially related to a video game, I would try to make a video game from it.
So after deciding you wanted to make video games, how did you first get into the industry?
I never really felt like I really got in the industry because I did undergrad, then I did grad school, which was video game related. But then after that, I just kind of started doing indie games. That was mainly because we had a project that, had a bunch of views on YouTube. And so I was kind of like, well, let's see if I can make this into a real thing. Felt like I didn't really call myself an indie developer until, a couple years before we actually shipped.
What was that first project that got some views?
So that was old prototype of Superliminal. So it was called Museum of Simulation Technology.
How did the original idea for Superliminal originate?
It originated because I was trying to figure out what I should do for kind of an AI programming class. And so this has nothing to do with AI, but I just want to make a game with that project. So I want to make a video game and then at the end add some, flocking birds as a little AI algorithm. I didn't have a lot of time, right? So I had to do something that didn't really require art, but was still really interesting. So I thought about, how do you move objects around in different ways? Because a lot of games do that, like Portal and stuff like that. They're all about moving objects in space, right? So after thinking about it for a long time, then, I thought, oh, maybe there's a thing I could do for my final project.
How large was the team that worked on Superliminal?
At the time of shipping, it was maybe 6 people full-time and then I think 2 other people part-time.
Were there any outside pieces of media that inspired some parts of Superliminal?
Yeah, there's quite a few because the game is about perspective and it's set in a dream. There's a lot of movies that we reference down then. There's, Eternal Sunshine. There's, Paprika, which is the anime. There's a lot of Charlie Kaufman stuff. Also art-wise, though, maybe there's some Wes Anderson movies here and there in terms of color palettes. And in terms of games, obviously there's, Portal and Antichamber and all that good stuff.
So how does the first idea for Superliminal differ from what ended up getting shipped?
Well, so the first idea was a little bit more tongue-in-cheek. It was very clean, so to say, because I was just using the same concrete texture again and again. So it was more cold, it was more clean. It was more focused on smaller experiences like, oh, here's one room, get out of this room, go to the next room, very simple structure. And then later on, we try to do, larger levels with lots of different nooks and crannies and stuff and adding a story on top of that. So it was just expanding kind of on the original idea until it felt a lot more fleshed out.
Were there any weird or interesting bugs that you and the team came across?
There's quite a few because we mess with physics a lot. One of them is weirdly not related to the main mechanic, but it's related to the fact that you can resize yourself using portals, essentially. So in a video game, you can't really tell how large you are except for your height and how fast you move, right? Mm-hmm. Because literally you're just a camera floating in space. And so when you make yourself, let's say from normal size to very, very small, if the time scale is the same, then even if you change, your movement speed and your height, things will feel off. And the reason is because imagine like you're watching a movie where you're a bunch of insects or something, right? And a giant human foot comes down from the sky. That foot's going to move really, really slowly because it's huge. Because usually you perceive large things moving in space as come down really slowly. But that's more of a time scale thing, right? Which has nothing to do with your actual, scale when going through a portal. So then we realize the weird thing is what would feel right, even though it's totally wrong, is when we make someone smaller, we essentially have to change the time scale of the game as well. So everything else felt like it was moving at a correct speed.
Were there any interesting ideas that ended up getting cut from the game?
Yeah, there were a couple. We had a couple of mechanics that was related to maybe screen space objects moving around. So, some like lasers or outlines and stuff. That was still perspective related, but it didn't quite feel really related as much to the game. Its mechanics aren't like that abstract, right? We try to make the mechanics of the games feel like something that could be magical, that could happen in real life. And when it gets too abstract, it kind of breaks that fourth wall a little bit,
Mhm.
So I think that's why we end up cutting some of them. And even though they're pretty cool.
How was playtesting done for Superliminal?
Some games have pretty rigorous playtesting kind of cycle. We didn't really do that. We would just send the build out to people on Fridays and have them play over the weekend. And then we would, watch the playthroughs and see what was going on Monday. Nothing's really complicated. We didn't really have enough space kind of in the office to set up our own, playtesting facilities. So that's just how we did it.
Which parts of Superliminal did you need to put the most time and effort into to get just right?
There's a couple. I think I'd actually say probably some of the mechanics, in the sense that, there's a lot of iteration from beginning to end. One was just the physical elements of it, because whenever you're moving objects through space, kind of willy-nilly, game engines tend to freak out. So we had to do things around that. Things get more complicated when you do portals and stuff. So then now you're moving an object through a portal, and then now it gets, the complexities are pretty crazy. Another one I guess is I'd say the level design stuff has also iterated a lot from beginning to end. And I think that's because it's kind of a delicate balance from saying it can't be too obvious, but it can't be too difficult either, right? You want a puzzle where people can figure out eventually, but still be difficult enough so they have that aha moment and still be new and interesting, right? Like a puzzle they've, hopefully not seen before. So all those are kind of challenging criteria to hit.
Was there anything that you had to fight for to keep in the game?
Personally, for me, it was probably some of the hallways, if that makes sense. So our game has a kind of like symmetrical kind of surreal look to it. And I think part of it, what I was trying to do is give it kind of that, Wes Anderson look, where things look a little bit surreal and look a little bit odd because of how kind of well and symmetrical they're placed. And I think to people on the team, especially when it's more of a prototyping phase and you don't have all the art and lighting in, it's kind of hard to tell what the point of it is. So if you're like, why are we walking down this hallway? Like, why don't we just cut the hallway, get to the next room? And I think it's just those kind of breathing moments that I really wanted to keep in a little bit.
How did the main mechanic of changing the size of objects with perspective originate?
That kind of originated, as I mentioned before, like trying to find a way to move objects through space. And, I thought about a lot of different ways. Maybe you grab an object, maybe you have a field that you can change the vectors of or something, but then it was all way too complicated. So at the end, I was kind of just like, well, what if you just dropped it off and that's what it looked like? And to me, it didn't quite make sense until I like tinkered with it a little bit. And then it kind of, and I didn't actually know it's like people call it forced perspective, but I didn't even know that term. So I couldn't really Google it. I didn't know that term until like 2 years later. So it was just like almost like a stroke of luck being, hey, what if I just do this crazy thing that, doesn't make any sense, and let's see what happens.
Sorry to pop in here, but I want to let you know about today's sponsor, Hoffman's Woodstuffs. They specialize in the design and fabrication of custom furniture made from reclaimed or sustainably sourced hardwoods. They also make custom goods and gifts for any occasion. You can find them on Instagram at Hoffman's Woodstuffs, or you can check out their website by going to hoffmanswoodstuffs.net or by checking out the link in the description. Stick around to the end of the episode to find out how you can get 20% off your next order. Let's get back into the interview. Loading screens in games are like a stable part, and you did like a really interesting one. How did you get the idea for that, and were there any interesting ones that got cut?
Yeah, so that one, I mean, those are mostly from Logan, our level designer. And I think it's because our game is kind of about unexpected, but also having the unexpected being shown to you in kind of like a little bit trolling, a little bit light sort of ways, right? Like a little Easter egg you find. And the idea was you see loading screens everywhere, but then how do you break your expectations at that, where this loading screen is going? And then Logan made a bunch of fun little prototypes on that. Because we just released like a multiplayer patch, there's also more multiplayer loading screens, and those are really fun too. I want to say, but Logan might disagree, is that I think all the good ones are in so far. He might disagree about that.
How did the scope change from the first idea to what you have now?
Yeah, the scope, it was kind of changing all the time, unfortunately, because at the very beginning, it was just a class project, right? I finished this in 1 week. And then after that, it was, hey, maybe I'll submit this for a thing. And then so I was just like, well, I'll make like a couple levels, right? A handful, like 5 or 6 levels at most. And after that, it was more of a semester project. So that was longer. And then after that, I was trying to make it into a whole thing. So kept on changing again and again. I think scope is the thing that kind of changes almost like a bell curve. So, and in the middle, you're not too ambitious and you're just like, oh, I'm just going to make something. In the middle, you get very ambitious. So your scope balloons out. And then at the end, you're like, I can't finish out any of this stuff. So I have to, cut a lot of stuff. So I think where we ended up was fine. Yeah.
As the player gets further into the game, there's some weird and interesting interactions with different objects. Were there any interesting interactions that got cut?
There were a couple that we just didn't have time to figure out. So for example, we had a bunch of projection stuff that, we could use projections in interesting ways. And along with portals, I think at the end we were considering, doing a recombination of a lot of our mechanics together. But I think one is just, we needed a lot more programming to make that happen, right? So imagine there's a portal somewhere and there's a projection that you have to stand in the right place to make it real, but you can't find it. You realize when you line up with inside the portal, then, stuff like that. But it's a lot more complicated. Some of that stuff we just had to cut in the end.
So out of the ones that you kept in the game, were there any that gave you a lot of issues and just took a while to get right?
Yeah. I mean, on the flip side, it's hard to think of any mechanic that didn't really give us that many issues. I think all of them were pretty tricky to work with, portals, just resizing, cloning was okay, I think. I think just because we play with physics so much, it's just hard getting everything to work perfectly, right? And when it doesn't work perfectly, sometimes the illusion breaks. So they all kind of gave us a little bit more trouble than we expected.
How long have you been working on Superliminal?
So I actually started, I want to say, end of 2012 or 13, but that was only like a week. And then in the next year, only like 7 weeks. And then the year after that, then that from then on was more closer to like a full-time schedule. So from then on to now, which we're still working on because we're releasing holiday multiplayer patch, before Christmas. So that's almost, I don't know, probably 7 or 8 years, I'd say.
What was the biggest design challenge you faced while working on Superliminal, and how did you fix it?
It's kind of interesting because we had a lot of design challenges. And I think whenever you have kind of a game that uses new mechanics, you end up with a bunch of custom design challenges because you're not, taking things that have already been done. So for example, one of them is we realized pretty early on that when you place something, you could always, it was almost too powerful. You could always use that object in a different way. And what I mean by that is you basically have infinite grab distance, right? Unlike usual objects, which you have to be an arm's length, you could grab something across the room, and you can place something across the room. You can place them at any size, assuming there's enough space, right? So that kind of gives the player a lot of freedom. And so that was really good because people could think of creative solutions, but at the same time, it made certain things hard, right? So, for example, if you put a cube on a button, you can go through the door and then come back and grab the cube immediately. While, in a game like Portal or something, if you put a cube on the button, that cube's essentially gone forever because you can't go back, unless you use a portal or whatever, then you can't go back and grab that cube. So we had to do things like make some barriers where the players could pass, but you can't take these items or project through, or some parts would be too easy. But another issue that we also had a lot of trouble dealing with is kind of the structure of the game and how do we fit a narrative inside it that ideally makes sense. And I think that's something that we kind of iterate on throughout. So that was also kind of a difficult thing to figure out.
What was the process for getting Superliminal onto the platforms you currently have it on?
We did PC first. I think we did Epic first. And I think we just, talked to them a couple times. And then, they finally decided to do it. Steam was pretty easy. I think GOG reached out. And then for the console platforms, we were kind of hitting them up a while before, because at some point we were like kind of contractually obligated to ship on certain platforms. So we already had contact of them, but then we didn't actually ship that on them until, more than half a year after our original release.
You talked about the multiplayer stuff that you're adding in the future around Christmas. Beyond that, do you have any more plans to add updates to the game in the future?
Yeah, it's hard to say. We'll kind of see how the multiplayer stuff goes on and see what happens. So the multiplayer stuff is already out, but we're just doing an extra patch to make it adding more rooms and more different things that could be interesting. Just making everything better. But really, because for us it's such a weird thing to do. So essentially, we have a single player game, and then now we're adding, weirdly enough, like online co-op in the online battle royale mode. Yeah, in name only, but it's just, we thought it would be crazy enough that might be interesting to people. So we wanted to give that a shot, but it kind of depends on how people, receive something. And if there's a lot of people playing it, obviously we'll, do more updates, but if nobody plays it, then, we might not do as many updates.
Was the ending that you currently have always going to be the ending, or were there different endings that have been tossed around or prototyped?
Yeah, there were a couple endings, but I think we always wanted to go with something that was a little bit more personal, a little bit more kind of heartfelt. We didn't really want the ending to be, like you defeated a big bad boss or anything. So we had a couple of different variations, but they're all, kind of on the same wavelength, but in terms of abstractness, there was a little bit of difference.
What would some of those other endings have been?
Well, I think some of them were a little bit more plot driven, almost like you would, face a certain person, you'd have a resolution that was more similar to like a traditional video game. And some of them were maybe like a little bit more abstract as well, because we tried a bunch of different things to see what would make the most sense.
Looking back now, what do you wish you could have done differently before the initial launch?
I think there's quite a lot. I think when we launched the game, I didn't feel like the game was perfect by any stretch of the imagination. So there's quite a lot. I think some of our puzzles could have been more difficult, because we talked about how it's hard to get that perfect balance between being too easy and not having an epiphany. So I think we could have done more work there. I think narratively, some people liked it, some people didn't. I think we could have, polished it a little bit more. I think those are probably the two main ones.
What was the biggest lesson you learned from working on Superliminal?
There's a couple of pretty big ones. I think one of them would probably be the game took this long because it was hard to have an overall vision that I liked. And then we were kind of going it step by step. We would make a little bit, explore a little bit, try to lay some groundwork. And I think, moving on, I would try to figure out more of that on my own. There's this hardship on other people because when you bring a group of people along with that process, then you are making stuff, cutting stuff, changing ideas. That can be pretty painful, just in terms of like making stuff and throwing away. So ideally, I'd have a clear vision, a lot of more solid pillars, and then bring people in and just be like, work in this space, but be creative in this space, and let's not go out of it. Yeah, and I think similarly, like some script writers have said, sometimes they don't work on a thing until they have the ending in their minds, right? Mm-hmm. So I think similarly, it's like it would be easier if I only start on certain things once I have a good kind of goalpost in mind.
What would be your biggest piece of advice to newer indie devs trying to get their first game made?
My advice might be a little bit weird. So I think usually there's the usual advice people say is just make something, get it out there, which I think is true. I think the other one is good games don't necessarily sell well, if that makes sense. And that's just from me seeing how hard it is to get a game out there, how many games out there are on Steam that are very solid games, but maybe don't do that well in numbers. And I think besides just making sure your game is a good and a solid game, it needs to have something that's maybe noteworthy to talk about, or something that kind of people will latch onto and think of once in a while. I think that really helps, even if, you're just starting out, because sometimes that just takes a little bit extra thought and it can make a whole load of difference.
Thank you so much for your time.
Great. Thanks so much.
And that's how the interview went down. I want to thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, make sure to hit that subscribe or follow button. It's different on every platform. And if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with Game Design Hour, you can check us out on Instagram, TikTok, or Twitter at Game Design Hour. If you want to get 20% off your next order from Hoffman's Woodstuffs, you can use code GDH20 at checkout. You can find Hoffman's Woodstuffs on Instagram at Hoffman's Woodstuffs, or you can find their website using the link in the description or by heading on over to hoffmanswoodstuffs.net. Hoffman's Woodstuffs specializes in the design and fabrication of custom furniture made from reclaimed or sustainably sourced hardwoods. They also make custom goods and gifts for any occasion. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.